Perhaps that's a good way in to kind of start by acknowledging what it is to be human, because I'm sure that our conversation today will be focused somewhat on the human aspect of organizations and how we can conduct ourselves in a manner that's kind of life-giving for us and for others around us, and at the same time create value together in our work.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think actually that's one of the biggest positive outcomes of the whole pandemic. That this somehow this fake dichotomy that we've created between work life, or work and life. Already this notion of a work-life balance somehow implies, because there's work and then there's life, so work doesn't include life somehow. That's a horrible notion,
Yeah.
And just being reminded that we're all humans, we all have multiple facets to ourselves, and incredibly many facets to ourselves, and we all have our challenges, and to kind of realize that it just has become so incredibly hard to uphold this facade that many of us have had, in our business lives, to kind of try to portray to be somebody that we don't really feel we are, in our hearts, and to kind of to engage in this business theater in a way. And I think for many of us, this is carried an enormous cost, to their well-being, and my hope is that this has kind of reminded us that, we're all in this together, and nobody's above that and beyond that, that we can acknowledge that and just say, that's part of who we are. We are not perfect. We have our many strings pulling in many directions, and how can we support each other? How can we still show up, making clear commitments and having clear agreements and getting stuff done that we care about. So not kind of collapsing this what might be perceived as a paradox, but honoring that paradox. Yes, there is tension there, and it seems like we cannot just choose one or the other, but without losing something important, right?
Yeah.
And I think this at the same time has proven to be very challenging, and this probably caused a lot of tensions for people. And at the same time, I think those tensions are incredibly fruitful in a way that they're triggering a lot of useful reflection, hopefully, or at least they're triggering something. And then the question is there an environment where I can kind of reflect on this and grow through it, and grow with other people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I see another paradox. It's like another kind of dualism that's kind of colliding with what you just described as well, and that's the issue of exponential tech.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that this pandemic has forced many online. We're seeing kind of protests in places like Google around, like increasing kind of increasingly grueling working conditions, the arrival of machines to replace people. You've got places like Los Angeles that are decimated now and have turned into a kind of camping ground where the streets are full of tents, and enormous displacement of people in the first world, let alone second and third world. And I'm kind of questioning how we're going to come back from that, actually, because it's not just the pandemic that's put people on the streets. It's the fact that many people were kind of on the line already, and the prospect of having meaningful work, is a luxury relative to just the prospect of having any work at all and any ability to sustain oneself at all. And I'm really concerned about that and how we're going to handle that in the future. And certainly there are different options on the table. And I think everyone, if they give it a moment's thought, can anticipate how many of those kind of emerging problems would be avoidable. Mechanisms like a universal basic income as an example, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're not really set up to accommodate that right now. And there's a lot of interests that would stand against that. Like, for example, in the United States recently, just the reluctance to follow through on the pledge of $2,000 more for people, you know, once the Biden administration came in, and then the kind of backhand negotiations that brought that down to $1,400 or $1,600 or whatever, you know. So if we can't figure that out, then universal basic income as a proposition is a long way off. But meanwhile, I'm wondering, what are we going to do, you know, about our, you know, for each other? Like, how are we going to move ahead somehow, considering these kind of quite large and impactful circumstances that are ahead on the horizon somehow, you know? So I'm as guilty, I wouldn't say guilty. I'm often kind of making the proposition that organizations do well to seek out people who are resonant with whatever the purpose of the organization is. I don't mean something like mystical and kind of like evolutionary purpose. I just mean what the reason the organization exists for, and finding people who are passionate about that and energized by it. Because I think that's going to lead to better engagement and better fulfillment, and in the long term, better results for everybody. But at the same time, as there's a contraction in the market, we also see a general contraction around the need for people in many contexts as well. So I don't have answers to that, but it's definitely a problem that's on my mind, and I'm not particularly sure right now or optimistic about how we're going to solve it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think this is pretty much at the core of why I do this work, because I think the increasing gap between the level of the average level of human consciousness, and the ever increasing complexity of the tools and technologies that we're creating, that's creating potential civilization collapse, you know. If you have technology in the hands of people who are not capable of anticipating the complexity of their actions, you know, that are potentially affecting everybody on this world, right? We now have technology, not just weapons, that as well, but also, you know, with artificial intelligence, and I mean the whole social media situation now is a very good example. You know, they're absolutely intelligent people at work there. There are no bad intentions, I would say, right? And yet you suddenly have machineries in place that are kind of changing humanity's psychology to a degree that nobody could have anticipated, and that has a major effect on our well-being, the further development of our societies, you know, social trust eroding, and in some places breaking down completely, and that's a huge problem we're facing.
Yep.
And the question that's on my mind very often is, how can we create, I mean, if we want to stand, if there's a chance at all for us to kind of, you know, see daylight in this whole situation, then I think the only chance we stay is that we somehow grow with this development, right? We need to somehow grow as adequately fast in relationship to the complexity of the technologies we create, right? And so I think, well, on one hand, of course, there's a clear limitation in terms of personal development. So I think if we make this an individual goal, then we have already lost, because no individual can can keep up with all these developments. And luckily we don't have to, because we can deal with a lot more complexity as a group than we can as an individual, right? And that's one of the biggest advantages I think we have as a species. But that, of course, then depends on how capable are we to kind of sense a lot of different information and signals, make sense of those signals, and then kind of process that and come to conclusions and make decisions and act accordingly. And I think there's a huge potential there. I think if we look at human organizations and how we deal with those things, they're just not set up in a way that make them very good at that, right? So at the moment, I think in most organizations, probably, I don't know, 70 or 80% of all the signals available just go unprocessed. They're detected, but the structures in place don't allow them to be processed in an efficient and effective way.
Yep.
And that's a huge problem, right? So you have a huge amount of signal loss. You have a lot of noise and you have a huge amount of signal loss. And that's not a very good combination. And so those are the two things that I'm very passionate about, right? Using organizations or seeing organizations as a place where human development, not in a utilitarian way where they're just like a cog in the wheel, but for its own sake, right? Mm-hmm. For the sake of society, right? The more we have mature adult people at hopefully ever increasing levels of adultness, because there's no one level of adultness, the better off we all are, independent of the concrete organization that I'm working in.
Yeah.
And at the same time, if we have better and better organizations where we can that allow us to coordinate better and make better decisions and process more meaningful signals and reject the noise, then that's a big advantage as well.
Yeah. So in a way then, like, organizations provide a kind of experimental playground for learning how to better organize, coordinate, sense make, and navigate in complexity together, mm-hmm. that can then also scale back to the wider world, mm-hmm. is what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one aspect that I'm always thinking about is there's a huge leverage, I think, with organizations, because organizations are amongst the most powerful entities in the world. If you look at the most powerful economic entities in the world, the top 100 list, I think probably by now more than 50% are private enterprises. Right, so there are more huge private enterprises amongst these top 100 than nation states, and that's just a very powerful fact, right? And now again, this can be positive or it can be negative, right? Of course, you have private enterprises now who have such power that they can just pick and choose how they want to be held accountable by laws and regulations, because they can just basically move freely in the world and they're just going wherever they want. So it serves their purpose best. And that's the question: what is their purpose, right? Is it just maximizing profits for a chosen few, or is it something else? Is there something additional to that? Not saying that that's a bad thing, but yeah, maybe it shouldn't be the only thing. Yeah, so yeah, I think we really have to, there are no finalized answers, right? No, I think nobody has an answer of this is how it's going to work. We just have to basically experiment. And to your point with UBI and similar ideas, right? I mean, there are some interesting data points on that. There have been research projects, but of course there are very few of those around by now. But yeah, I think that's one of the main challenges also. We have to be more open to not knowing, right? To kind of realizing, okay, I have my opinion, I have my preferences, but those only take me so far. And if I want to move into new territory, it's wise and it serves me well if I recognize that I probably don't know many things that I will encounter in this unknown new territory. And if I just think, oh well, there's a big furry animal, it looks like a cat, but it's just way bigger, and I know cats that are very cuddly and nice. Well, that might be a wrong that might lead to maybe not the outcome that I anticipated, right? So yeah, that's difficult, right? Not knowing and admitting to ourselves that don't know many things. It's difficult.
Sure. It's also a big relief. Yeah.
Totally. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And there's none so foolish as those who fool themselves, they know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was listening to conversations this morning around the necessity of collective sense making, how we need each other to make sense of things, and how humility and acknowledging the potential limitations of our own interpretations of the world is so important as a starting point. And if we can learn to harness those different perspectives without succumbing to the temptation to kind of come down one side or the other and polarize, then we start to see the nuance and to weave nuance together in ways that help us make more sense than we could alone. And so I think that's going to be fundamental as we move forward. And at the same time, in the social media landscape, you've got these, this algorithm selected content that's just by its nature tending to throw information at people that they think, that it seems they want to know, and polarize them with whatever they might perceive as opposite to that or a threat to that somehow. So this whole kind of movement is tending to degenerate people's capacity for nuance, and to withhold reaction whilst hearing an argument through and looking for the kind of positive essence maybe of what it is that's being shared before slicing and dicing that to pieces. So I see that at a moment when we need to be able to have more nuanced conversations more than ever, and when we face more complexity than ever before, and when it's never been more important than now that we can start to make more sense of complexity. At the same time, there's a general kind of devolution towards a much more polarized, isolated, and in some respects quite aggressive point of view.
Yeah.
Again, this is a kind of, it's as if, well, I've thought this for a long time. When people say, do you think things are getting better or worse? It's like, I think they're getting everything more. It's like as terrible things happen, great things are born. As great things happen, terrible things are born. And it seems like just the whole field is expanding somehow. And the challenge is how to surrender into that expansion in ourselves as well, without kind of collapsing too much into one side or the other and separating from half of ourselves.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, and then, social media I think is a very interesting point there, because if you just look at the technology itself, the positive thing about it is that we figured out, wow, this technology is really, really potent. It has the power to really shift the way a large chunk of humanity is thinking and behaving. And that's a very powerful thing, right? Now, the question is, to what ends are we using this technology? Are we using it to kind of to sell more ads, to make people click, like you know, like I don't know, like completely mindless beings, right? Just so yeah, basically some people earn more money for things that probably nobody needs, or are we using this technology maybe to everybody's benefit? Mm-hmm. Right? So I think we need to be careful not to be very nuanced about what is good and what is bad, or what leads to outcomes that are bad for us and what leads to outcomes that might be good if we somehow change the context, if we change certain elements in the context, right? Mm-hmm. And so there the question is like, what are the incentives and where these incentives come from that make this a reasonable behavior, right? Because that's the thing. I mean, this behavior is completely reasonable, right? To maximize profits and to choose a business model that makes people stay on site as long as possible and click as many ads as possible. That's a completely reasonable behavior if you look at the incentives in place. Now the question is, are these incentives, is this total outcome serving us well, right, as society? And or not? And if not, which one of those incentives might we need to change, and how, and what would be maybe a first experiment that we could run that would give us some insight into what could work better, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's a tendency to very quickly reject something wholesale, right? Like, okay, social media and, you know, Facebook and Twitter and all these companies, they're bad and they're evil. But I think that's kind of, you know, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's tremendous opportunity and potential there. It needs to be tweaked for sure. But I think it would be horrible if we would just throw out all these accomplishments that these companies have made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. I heard someone, I'm not sure what I think about it yet because I haven't thought about it enough to draw any conclusions, but it was the proposition that capitalism in the way we know it is in its death throes. Mm-hmm. And the example that I gave was, if you go into YouTube to watch a video, and these days it's rare to find a video that you can click on without getting an ad in your face before anything else. And the statistics are something like 99.8% of people or something curse when that happens every time, and wait the 5 seconds, and curse even more when it says wait until the ad's finished and then your video will play. Mm-hmm. You know, it's just, but people are still clicking on these things, obviously, because otherwise it wouldn't be worthwhile to share them. So they were saying the future really of reaching people isn't like trying to squeeze yourself in somewhere in a situation where, generally speaking, people don't really wish to meet you, but about building your networks, you know, and about, in the future, the proposition was that we will be part of smaller networks, you know, around common interest. And it will be the people we know and the connections we have that will kind of grease the way for those opportunities for us, you know, to be able to deliver something of value into the world. And I was thinking about that in relation to experiences I had with Facebook. So I never wanted to be on Facebook, but I jumped in there a few years ago because I thought it was a good place to connect with people, and many people were there. Mm-hmm. And then a year and a half ago, I just had enough. I just stopped going in there. We had an S3 page in there, and there was like 1,500 members at the time, and I just left. I couldn't bear it. It was like an allergic reaction. And recently we decided, well, let's go back in there, you know, and reconnect. But what I see has happened since then is the whole system has changed. So now, instead of kind of creating an environment where it's easy for me to connect with my network there. Generally speaking, posts that would be relevant for the network aren't brought to the attention of others in my network. What's brought to their attention is kind of cherry pick content and ads, right? So it's not really a platform anymore for staying well connected with a network, not in the way it was, at least. So there's this kind of, that's a double negative, right? If this proposition of this guy I was listening to has any truth in it, because the ad approach is dying anyway. We need networks, and at the same time, Facebook, as an example, is going in exactly the opposite direction in both ways. Increasing ads and diminishing the potential for people to actually stay in contact with each other. So we do need another way, and I'm not convinced Facebook are going to make a pivot on their business strategy at this point.
Maybe not. Yeah. And sometimes I think, sometimes things have to die. Sometimes they're not able to make the changes in the time available, and maybe something else will pop up and just, basically that has already made, kind of integrated the learnings of others. And it's just more nimble and more adaptive, and then maybe that takes us in another direction. I don't know. I'm always keeping my eyes open for new platforms and stuff like that. But of course, you have the network effect, so that's a powerful thing, right? So as long as a majority of people are on a certain platform, it's you have to pay extra kind of to shift to another platform. But it's happening. I think Signal is a great example, right?
Sure.
So I don't know, over the last couple of months, we've been on Signal now for our team for maybe 9 months or something like that. We decided, okay, after we've watched The Social Dilemma, we kind of said, well, okay, are we just, it's an interesting movie, but now let's move on, or are we what does that mean to us? And one of the outcomes was that we decided, okay, we're going to be on Facebook and LinkedIn, but we're not going to advertise there. We're not going to pay money to basically manipulate people. So we're just going to use it as a platform to spread information, to connect with people, and that's it. And that was a decision that we made there, that we're not going to spend any money on ads. And the other decision was that that we're going to switch to Signal as just a messaging platform that we're using. And ever since then, so many people from a network have switched to Signal, and I think they've had many incidents when they were kind of overwhelmed by new people signing up. But that's one example where you can see that, okay, it works, right? So there is an alternative out there that seems to be pretty valuable for many people.
And people appreciate that, right? And they appreciate their data being private and not being sold by whatever means.
Absolutely.
So how about we see if we can, talking of switching platforms, let's see if we can switch gears a little bit and head somewhat toward a conversation that we were intending to have today.
Absolutely.
I think it's very relevant, actually, what we're talking about, because, well, from my perspective, what I see is we're kind of laying out the big picture, the field that we're all in right now. And having that in mind as a context for organizations is useful. And there's some meta kind of questions around, ethics and in terms of organizations, and what organizations stand for. There's this polarity between profit at all cost, even if that's to the cost of people, versus organizations that serve people, which after all is the whole reason why we ever came together to collaborate in the first place at all as human beings.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the current context that we're in and all of the challenges that brings. So that's quite a lot for anyone in an organization and any group of people to be dealing with. And of course, your primary area of work the last years has been focused around holacracy. Mine has been focused around Sociocracy 3.0. And prior to that, the Sociocratic circle method. And so I'm waiting for the conversation to come out that we had with, hosted by the Teal Network a week or so back, where we got into some conversations around the kind of common ground underpinning Holacracy, S3, Aquacy we spoke about, and Rendanhe as well. But we said, let's get together today and kind of drill in a bit more to, well, the way we put it was continue and deepen the exploration of commonalities, shared foundations, differences and synergies between Holacracy and S3 and beyond that. So I think maybe we've done the beyond that first, and now we can back up to Holacracy and S3.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had some ideas about what I would like to explore today with you, but before we get into that, how about you share a bit about whatever you might have been bringing or hoping for from the call today?
Yeah, so I think over the few times that you've spoken until now, there are some questions that I really would like to explore, because those are the things that I think I don't really know much, know enough yet about S3 to really have a good sense of how you generally approach it. Or I would just be interested in what's your take on that, and that's mainly about basically, let's say, pacing of the transformation, or basically another way of putting it is basically cherry picking certain elements, and whether that has a critical effect on the outcomes that people actually aim for, right? And I know from the holacracy practice, that's always a hot topic and a debated topic, right? Is it too much too soon? This being imposed is this big chunk of change. Is this useful, or does this make sense, or what are the pros and cons? And so, to my understanding, well, what S3 proposes is a much more incremental approach to that. So basically, there are all these patterns, and you pick the patterns that make most sense for you, and that you derive an immediate benefit from, and that makes total sense. To me, the question that I have in that respect is, I think, how do you see a lot of companies that really, I don't know, for me, it's like the way I always talk about it is like this phase shift where they really get completely new capacities in a way, right? Where really you see a radically different way people interact together, where certain behaviors really shift in a very noticeable way. And I'm still trying to figure out if there's if you need to have a minimal amount of change for that shift to happen, or if it can also happen, kind of more organically over a certain period of time. My hypothesis at the moment is that if you leave it open to just, making individual choices, then it's possible, but it's not necessarily guaranteed that you have this outcome. And I think in our work, that's also our intention. If we work with a client, our intention is that we kind of support them in really making the shift quickly and reliably and in a sustainable way, right? And so, for example, we've been actually, we've basically decided not to work with certain clients because they said, well, that's not what we want at the moment. And we said, well, that's fair enough, and it's perfect. And you have other very good options available. But that's not really the work we're doing at the moment. And so that's one of my questions that I would be really interested in exploring with you.
Yeah. Well, so I made a few notes before the call. I was kind of breaking it down into this question of commonalities and key differences and benefits and so on. And so just let me check here, because there's a couple of things I wanted to share with you. I think it's one of the key differences, I think, of Holacracy versus S3 is that Holacracy, mindful of recent changes to Holacracy, but in general offered a whole system approach for organizations. So I say mindful of recent changes because, of course, now it's been broken down into these 5 modules. And I think that's a good idea. In fact, 2015, Bernard and I were making predictions about the future of Holacracy. And without sounding facetious, we predicted that one day it would look very similar to S3, because it would just need to continually break down into the different patterns, because regardless of whether something's a good idea or not, human nature will be, to pull in more or less of what's on offer from anything, whether that's Holacracy or S3. So I'm not surprised, and I think it's a good direction, this idea of this kind of modular approach more. But that said, in general, if you could take the whole system of Holacracy and kind of upload it into your organization, and it's going to be coherent somehow, and it will be a better or worse fit for the organization itself, depending on the context. Whereas S3, it breaks everything down into pieces, So you can build Holacracy with S3, or you can build the Sociocratic circle method, or you can put Scrum together with S3 patterns. But in and of itself, it's just the component parts. And whilst you can argue that there's better and worse ways to put many of those patterns together, you can build systems that might look quite similar across different organizations. Nonetheless, there's this kind of artistic license, and it would never make sense, unless you're an enormous organization in a certain context, to have all currently 74 patterns alive and present in the organization somehow, because there's going to be some that just don't make sense in a certain context. So that's like a big selling point on both sides, I think, because if you're looking for something that you can just kind of upload into the system, and there's a clear path for learning for people, and it looks like it's going to be good enough, and that's how you want to spend your time, then I think Holacracy, like many of these whole system options, can be a good way to start. Whereas on the other hand, if you're looking for an iterative and incremental approach and just identifying and prioritizing areas of need and pulling in patterns, then S3 is going to provide you with a good option. And I think there are pros and cons with both approaches, actually. The problem with the whole system approach is you might end up pulling in a ton of things that weren't really relevant to start with. They might impact or lead to changes that kind of somehow diminish effectiveness in certain areas, or like throw babies out with bathwater, because you sometimes throw away elements that were in place in the system based on the wisdom of what happened before, and the replacement might be counterproductive rather than beneficial. But you've got a pretty good starting point. Whereas S3, the question is, well, where do you start to begin with? And S3 predicates on people having a pretty good understanding of patterns individually, but also how they start to segue together. And because S3 is free, and it's like just the patterns are available and people can pull them in, people often interpret them through the lens of their own existing paradigm, more or less accurately. And I've seen examples of people who just kind of freestyled with S3 patterns and created an enormous amount of waste in an organization because of misunderstandings and misinterpretation of things. Yeah. So both approaches can have their pros and their cons. In terms of, this question you're asking around, does it work, that you just kind of leave people to their own devices to pull in patterns and there's going to be some kind of organic transformation occur? Whilst that can happen, I think that the latency of habitual ways of doing things is very strong for people. And considering the fact that often people are motivated to look for ways to change things because they're in a vulnerable state somehow. When vulnerable, we're most inclined to fall back on our habitual ways of doing things. So what I like, not about holacracy per se, but what I like about making that commitment and saying, okay, we're going to install these constraints and that's the game we're going to play, is that in those moments of vulnerability, when the habitual behaviors kind of show back up, then you have this added component of commitment and intention to kind of resist reverting back to the old way. And at that interface between the habitual and the new, that's where the potential for consciousness resides, right? That's where you can not only kind of think more deeply about this alternative you're considering, but you can also become a bit more aware maybe of your habitual way of doing things, rather than just identifying with it by default and running that pattern somehow. So I'm of the opinion that making some kind of conscious intention to do something different is worthwhile, and then investing in the discipline required to persist with that, to the point at least where the habitual behavior is conscious, the alternative is conscious, and a choice can be made more intentionally and consciously about how to proceed. That's a good idea. Where I think the line is when, despite common sense emerging from that more conscious perspective, it indicates that doing things differently in a certain case might be a good idea, differently to the old way or the new way. I think when you're stuck with the need to persist with that new way, and you're not allowed somehow to divert from that, then potentially you run into the same problems you were trying to get away from to start with. So one of the question marks I have over holacracy itself as a model is, how does it evolve on the basis of objection to the system itself? And to what degree can people kind of move? So in terms of S3, S3 patterns are adaptable. You can take them, leave them, adapt them according to your context. The problem with that is people often adapt the pattern according to their assumptions about the pattern and their past experiences, and adapt them in ways that make them dysfunctional, and then they have a negative experience from it. So that's the disadvantage of having something that can shift and adjust, you see. So I'm just laying out a few of the different aspects here. There's more I could talk about, but I think this is part of the problem. And my conclusion is, one, there's not a right or wrong way to go. Secondly, we shouldn't underestimate the power of our habitual behaviors and the good reasons why in the past we learned to behave in the ways that we do, even when that behavior in the current day might lead to situations that we're trying to avoid. And thirdly, my personal opinion is that the more explicit you can make a commitment for a period of time to undergo a learning and unlearning journey, the better. And I share your conclusion that if that commitment doesn't exist in an organization, and it's not held by a large enough number of people throughout that organization as an intention, then it's inevitable that you're going to run into problems. And it's also quite likely that your experiment to transform the organization is going to fail somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think I always like to draw on analogies from, from like normal everyday life. If I want to get fitter, if I want to do more sports, just be more, or eat more healthily, first of all, I need to be committed to it. I need to find a reason for myself I need to kind of develop a person of my future self that kind of wants to be that way, right? Where I see the benefits and where I can see how this would be better for me. And I kind of, that's a positive goal that I'm aiming at, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I don't find that within myself, then there's no way I'm going to put in the effort that's required to make the necessary changes and to build the new habits and to unlearn maybe old habits, right? And I think it's very much the same with organizational transformation, right? So first of all, you need I think that's crucial, the senior leaders of the organization in a traditional sense, to kind of go through that process. Like, what is it that they're, so one of the questions that I'm always asking in the early stage of collaboration with the client is, like, what's your fantasy about what will be different if you start working with Holacracy, and how is that relevant? Why is that important to you? How do you make sense of that, right? What would it mean in a positive way for the organization and for yourself if your company were able to work like that, right? And then very quickly you see if there's any depth to that, right? If it's just, well, we want to get more efficient. Okay, well, that's a worthwhile goal, and is that it? And then maybe if that's it, then I would say, well, maybe there are more direct ways of just becoming more efficient, right? Maybe then Holacracy is a bit too much to just become more efficient. If you don't have any other problems or goals, then I don't know if Holacracy is really the best fit for you. Mm-hmm. Sure, Holacracy down the road will probably lead to more efficiency, maybe not in the way you imagine it, but maybe in a more broader perspective, right?
Yeah.
But that's exactly one of the points that you will only find out very often in the course of action, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, there are many good points to follow. So,
well, let me just add one more thing on that before we head off from here. So, there's an interview that I'm going to be sharing on the S3 community in the coming couple of weeks with Mira Bangle and Hugo Lopez. They give some various examples of where they've been pulling in S3. But one of those examples is in their collaboration with Nair Group and K2K, who are based here primarily in Spain and Portugal. And they work with organizations around transformation. They have a long history of successful transformations, often in organizations that were struggling. And when I say transformation, I mean transformation towards self-managing systems, basically.
Yeah.
And so they give a couple of examples of where now they're introducing S3 patterns as a kind of precursor for organizations that want to undergo this kind of transformation. But what's one thing that's interesting, and we talk about during the call, is that they set a criteria of a minimum of, I think it's 80 or 85% of people in the organization who agree to the change and are committed to it. Secondarily, they make an agreement with the CEO that, or whomever is leading the organization, if it's set up in that way, that in the event that they get in the way of the transformation, they'll be removed and replaced by a representative from K2K. And thirdly, no one is fired.
The CEO will be replaced.
Yeah, so they make that agreement with the CEO.
Wow.
And thirdly, nobody will be fired. Right. So if they reach that critical mass of enough people who are committed to the journey, then still that doesn't mean to say those who aren't have to leave. They have the option to stay. But if there's that critical mass, then the transformation will proceed. And they get awesome results. But I think one of the reasons for that is that precondition, that if it's a company with 50% of people who are on the fence or opposed to it, they don't even go there to start with. And I think that's an interesting point to have in mind. Daniel Mezek talks a lot about invitation-based change. We've had many conversations about that over the years. We've got a pattern in S3 called invite change. And of course, it's not that you should always just invite change. Sometimes you need to make a decision and say, we're going this way, even if an individual or a small group of people protest somehow. But one, it's important to consider the wisdom that might be in their protest, because often there is. And secondly, despite the fact a new trajectory might be carved by the organization, still welcoming and offering a place to those people is probably a good idea. So a big learning for me the last years around S3 has been moving from this kind of, in a way, I think we kind of rode the wave of a semi-polarization to whole system implementations, because I was coming out of SCM that proposes a whole system implementation, and then Holacracy was doing the same, and many other approaches around that were making that same kind of narrative. So we went very much to the pattern side of things. But it's not enough just to kind of have those on the shelf for people to pick and choose as they want. There has to be an investment in learning. There has to be a commitment and a willingness to do it. And there needs to be some kind of persistence and consistency across time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I see regarding to that is that very early on in the stage where you actually make these decisions, you're often not really in the position to make an informed decision, right? Because if you look at these personal development shifts, right, very often the first stage is that you kind of you get a gut feeling or a sense there's something else. You have this very fuzzy perception of something new emerging within you, right? You cannot really put it into words yet. You cannot really have a nuanced conversation around it. It's more like a feeling, an intuition, right? And that's very powerful. That's the beginning of this emergence of your new self in a way, right? A broader perspective that kind of begins to emerge within you. And so, I mean, the analogy I always draw is basically on with for example martial arts, right? You have maybe you're familiar with this. It's been used in the agile community for many years. The concept of shuhari, right, where we basically have these three stages to mastery, and the first stage is that you learn something as you're being told to do something, right? So that's clearly where you do katas, for example, right? So you basically just repeat certain movements until you have them kind of you've learned them, the muscle memory. You've built muscle memory, right? And also, for example, the idea of the black belt being the mark of the beginner, right? So you're basically at a point where you can practice by yourself because you can self-correct. You know when you're doing something wrong, you notice it. Oh, now I did something wrong, and I know how it should be and why it should be like that, and I can self-correct. That doesn't mean that I'm always doing it perfectly, right? Very often I will notice not making a perfect movement or an adequate movement, but I notice it and I can self-correct for it, and I can practice better. And I think this capacity has to be learned. It has to be built first, right? And you don't just have that. And I think that's one of the critical challenges at the beginning of such a transformation, right? So if you're asking people who are really at the early stage of this process to make these kinds of decisions, what are they basing those decisions on, right? And so what I find very useful about holacracy, and I have started to call it not a whole systems approach, but the way I look at it more is like it's a minimally viable set of patterns. So, and this is actually even more so with version 5, like you said, right? And I totally agree with you. I think that's a very interesting and an important evolution. And I'm still very open to if that's going to lead to better practice or worse. We will find out. I think there are potential benefits. There are also potential risks because of exactly what we're talking about right now. But I think that the fact that the different modules in the Constitution now, they're more self-contained, right? They're more modular. They're more like a self-contained pattern. That's definitely a huge step forward. But I think that's the thing, right? So if you just pick one of these patterns, of course you will derive some benefit from it, right? But you will not get anywhere near this shift or this point where you have really built all the necessary knowledge to do karate or kung fu or something like that, right? It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And that's the question that I always had, or the curiosity that I always have. For example, if you work with a company, interested in implementing S3 patterns, do you have in your mind like a set of minimally viable set of patterns that you say, well, basically, no matter what your context is, you should probably 99% of the cases, those patterns are probably useful for you because those are kind of foundational to any practice.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Interestingly, last year, as one of the ways to kind of answer that question, where do we start? And it's not enough to say, well, if you look at navigate via attention in S3, it helps you find out where to start because it's wherever you have a prioritized area of need in the organization. But I get the question that people are asking, and they've often asked, is there a minimal viable set of patterns? And I think there are. And at the beginning of last year, just before the lockdowns began, Bernard came over here to Spain and we sat down for 3 days to see if we could figure out a kind of framework of those patterns. Interestingly, what came out of that, which was much more than a 3-day inquiry in the end, we spent about 6 months working on it, was the common sense framework. And the common sense framework is actually a set of 10 principles that are relevant for developing teams and organizations. And we added to that where both the people and the organization can thrive. And I think that's a pretty fair summary of what those principles support. And we came to the conclusion about these principles because you can see them reflected in most organizations that are handling complexity quite well and in a manner that is conducive both to the people and the organization. And on the back of that, then, as well as offering that as a sense-making tool in and of itself, which is very interesting. It's one, it's like just having a conversation around those principles and their relevance, more or less, in an organizational context you're involved in. But secondarily, identifying areas of need according to those principles and where you can see that it would be valuable to make interventions. And sometimes you get kind of second and third order consequences from an intervention in relation to one principle that's going to impact others. So it helps with prioritization as well, regardless of whether you're working with Holacracy or S3 or anything else for that matter. But then we said, well, let's look at which patterns from S3 would support interventions to support challenges and opportunities in relation to those principles. So that was one way into S3. Of course, what that didn't do was offer this minimal set of viable patterns. And I'm still a bit reluctant, to be honest, to do it. And it's not because I don't think that there's a minimal set of viable patterns. It's because I'm not convinced that kind of selling that as a package is gonna, in all or even in some at least, if not many cases, going to be the most valuable way to start for people in organizations. Because there's this deep tendency in human beings to look outside of ourselves for the answer, to love or hate what we find, and then to go all in for a while without really understanding why, and run with it for a while. And we might start in love and then fall out of love at some point down the line. And if there's not a kind of commitment of marriage somehow, then we just kind of piss off somewhere else and go and find a new a new path instead, you know? So it's not that I don't see a number of patterns that absolutely make sense. And approximately speaking, in Holacracy, if you look at those 5 modules, you've come to exactly the same conclusions we have. You know, it's like clarifying existing responsibilities throughout the organization, defining, well, we say domains in a slightly different way, but, you know, defining the areas of responsibility and autonomy that people have, linking through the system in ways that enable information to flow, distributing power to influence in a manner that maximally frees people up to create value and handles dependencies, putting in place ways to handle interaction, you know, focused interactions between people, having ways to handle operations and governance throughout the organization. You know, that's approximately what you've come to now, and it's exactly what we came to as well. And the reason for that is, I think, because it just makes sense to do those things. But I'm hesitant to come down too heavy on that and say, do this, because life is nuanced, and whilst it might be a good idea, as you were saying earlier, people aren't always ready for that. You know, that's what's nice about this iterative approach with Holacracy now. I think it's like you can start with one kind of set, if you like, and progress from there. And there is something kind of intuitive and linear about that progression, I think. So, yeah, yes, there is. Yes, I'm still hesitant about coming down too explicitly on what that would look like.
One thing that I'm also curious about is, so if we are approached by a new organization, very often there's still, in almost all cases, there's a very strong tendency towards seeing holacracy as a technical challenge. I don't know, Ron Heifetz, this business professor, has this, he makes this distinction between technical challenges and adaptive challenge, right? Where basically a technical challenge is just, you have to learn some new skills, a method, and then you just apply the method, and that's that, right? And an adaptive challenge is basically where you have to become somebody else to really rise to the challenge. And very often, in almost all cases, if new companies approach us, they're looking, or in the way they think about it is a technical challenge, right? You give us a training, you tell us how to do it, how it works, and then we're going to go ahead and do it. And I think one realization that I've had is that that's just the way it is. So there's nothing I can do at this stage to kind of make them aware that it's going to be an adaptive challenge, other than just inviting them to do it in a way, running with it, right? Running with the misperception in a way, right? And having them experience along the way that, okay, wow, this is actually much more than I have thought it would be. In a way, this is really putting in question how I'm doing things, and it's inviting me to to inquire into certain ways I've been doing things, and my reactions to certain things, and I think that's, for me, the central question is, and I'd be curious also to hear your perspective on this from the S3 side. In the Holacracy community, one increasingly stable data point that we have is that DIY implementation, so basically organizations that are just taking it and winging it and just doing as well as they can, unfortunately they don't have a very good success rate. There's a pretty high failure rate, in the sense that they're not really getting the benefits that they were hoping for, or that they're kind of discontinuing using the Holacracy practice and saying, well, it didn't work for us, right? And I think it makes total sense if you think about how big the gap is, and exactly what we were talking about before, right? You need to have, I think it's almost impossible to get to a mature practice if you don't have some kind of guidance especially in the early stages, because it's very easy to learn the wrong technique in a way. Then it's much more difficult to kind of unlearn that again down the road and to correct for it, right? And so there now, the interesting thing is there are different approaches to that, right? How do you provide the scaffolding, right? So when you realize, okay, actually I cannot really learn this new behavior completely by myself, right? I need some kind of external supporting structure to help me grow into it. And that can be, you know, that can be a coach, it can be a mentor, it can be a book, it can be experienced colleagues, or it can be some kind of some kind of framework that kind of defines, okay, those, start with those few practices, right? And that's, I think that's also a distinction that I see, right? So for example, in Holacracy, that's something that I like. Basically, it defines this minimally viable set of patterns and says, well, if you're going to start with those, you're probably going to be okay. Well, it's still not a guarantee that you're going to be, you know, that you're going to be really good at it, but those are the minimally required set of patterns, of practices to really become to have a mature self-management practice, right? That's not just like superficial thing, you know, new ways of wording. Mm-hmm. Whereas on for example, yeah, that's always the question that I've had, and I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on that. With S3, I see the potential that there's more. I've also had conversations around this with Ted Rao. If you see more of a dependency on an external coach, so basically that the wisdom is basically in the coach, and they tell you, okay, look, now you should probably use this pattern because that's what's addressing your current need. And you see here's how you do it, because you don't have like this basically foundational document that kind of ties things together. So you're kind of relying on the expertise and the wisdom of another person to do that for you. Mm-hmm. I think one of the probably the biggest value I see in the Holacracy Constitution is basically a codification of experience, right? It's basically the codification of, well, now 10 plus years of iterative development and kind of the wisdom of that, of a whole community distilled into a single document. And that's what you get if you build upon this foundational document, right? Mm-hmm. And it has its challenges, of course.
Yeah. Well, let me see that, because I think there's a few different points you bring up there. I'll see if I can pluck out some of them. So firstly, you need to clarify what you define as success. So you speak about a mature, kind of truly, I think truly is my word, but self-managing system. Mm-hmm. Your objective is that, and if you define a mature, truly self-managing system as a group of people who are running on Holacracy, for example, then I suppose you're going to measure success to the degree it looks like that or not. When it comes to S3, it's quite difficult to, you can't say that people are successful pulling in S3 because it doesn't make any sense to start with. It's the same as you can't say people have implemented S3. That doesn't make sense either, which is good and bad, right? But for the sake of the argument, it's just not true if somebody says it, because you'd have to ask, well, what does that look like? You know, there's so many different ways you could go about doing that. So one way to think about success, well, let me give an example. The guy Lily and I spoke to one day, who we hadn't seen for a year or so, who said You know, the biggest learning I had from learning about S3 was stopping asking people if they agree and asking people if they have any objection instead. He said it changed not only my life personally and professionally, but also my whole organization as well. And he saw that as an enormous success, right? And of course, there were other things that he was doing there, but he was in a position of influence. It might even have been his organization, and that had a massive improvement. I can think of another customer who simply put a poster up on the meeting room walls, in all the meeting room walls, with artful participation on there. And the question is, my behavior in this moment, the greatest contribution I can make to the effectiveness of this organization. Everybody became radically more self-conscious in a positive way and was much more mindful about how they conducted themselves forevermore in the organization, which led to an enormous positive impact in the system, right? Yeah. So you can take a pattern in its own merit and ask, well, what was the problem or you were trying to solve, or the opportunity you were trying to leverage, and then did that pattern, when you pulled it in, add value in some way? And arguably some of those, like artful participation or checking for objections, can have 6, 7, 8-figure benefits over the long term if you just look in monetary return alone, right? The goal of S3 isn't to facilitate the emergence of a self-organizing system. No, S3 patterns can be pulled in to enable self-management, whatever you would define that as for a system, but they can also be pulled in to create more effectiveness and or just simply efficiency in a kind of more traditional hierarchical and a system with a typical management hierarchy, for example. So you have to kind of take a nuanced view on how you would define success. On the other side of that, I can think of an example of an organization who published online their kind of version of a constitution based around S3. I heard news of this organization and the fact that they'd adopted S3, which immediately set the alarm off for me, because I thought, well, that instantly demonstrates a kind of low resolution understanding of S3. I read the constitution, which was kind of interesting, and to a point was kind of, well, it was kind of 80% technically correct, I guess you could say. But when I spoke with the CEO of that company at some point later, via someone else who was quite passionate about S3 in the organization, it was pretty apparent to both he and I that they had made some kind of radical errors, actually, one in interpreting S3, but two in just applying patterns in a manner that wasn't appropriate or useful, that had led to enormous waste in that organization. I mean, like, I wanted to, and I want to cry tears just thinking about it, you know, because it was just such a kind of disastrous and avoidable. It would have been avoidable with just 2 hours of conversation spread over a few months of time, right? Yeah. So is there a dependency more on the coach? It's like, in a way, the question's a bit irrelevant, because S3 is so free and available, people will just take it and interpret it through their own lens and apply it anyway. You know, I think that's one of the downsides of having shared it in the way that we did. It's good, and I still believe that's a good way to go, but people will underestimate how challenging it can be sometimes. We underestimated, and I think our early narrative was just pull in patterns, learn as you go. You know, it was kind of this. I'm much more cautious about kind of painting it so rosy and simple these days, because I don't think it is. So in terms of, I can't speak for Ted Rao and the Sociocratic Circle method, or SOFA's kind of interpretation of that, Sociocracy for All's interpretation of that. But I think in general, as human beings, we do well to be connected to others who have experience besides our own. And if there are people who have more experience than us in certain areas, then we do very well to have a relationship with them. so that at the very least there's some kind of exchange. We can bounce around ideas, get feedback, and if not to receive advice, at least to get kind of reflection and feedback and be coached and invited to reflect on what we're doing. And I think on the other side, we also have a responsibility to step into our role as elders of competence, and to be proactive in being out there in the world and supporting others as well. And I don't think, socially speaking, in the West, this is so present as a first kind of conclusion for people as being important to do. So we seem to be in a time of like increasing individualism, and disconnection, and people just doubling down in their own little silos and getting on with things. And on the one hand, we're tribal, and I think that's good and natural that we would do that. But open systems is a pattern in S3, and it kind of says, keep your system open, like make sure you're connected to others and have enough transparency around what you're doing so you can reap the benefits of someone else's perspective based on experience or even just hypothesis where they might see something you're not seeing and be able to help you learn and improve. So that's what I'm interested in. It's like how as a steward of S3 and as someone who I take some responsibility for that disastrous scenario that I was describing, because through an absence of describing clearly enough or explicitly enough, I don't know. It's like I share accountability, I should say, for that somehow. So this question of how do we kind of help people to understand a little bit more about some of those less obvious challenges around things, but at the same time stay true to what S3 is about, which is helping people learn how to better help themselves. So when a company says, do you offer consultation? I say, no, I'm an ex-consultant in relation to S3. I don't offer consultancy because you know better than I do what you need. What I can offer you is experience around S3. I can support you in identifying aspects of S3 that might be useful, and I can help you to learn about those patterns so that you can use them effectively for yourself. And if you're interested in investing in learning, both you individually, but also throughout the organization as a whole, then let's have that conversation. But please don't create dependency on us to teach everybody. Invest in developing your own internal experts. Support a few people who are passionate about this and have existing competence and skills that are resonant with it to learn. And then, we'll support them to support everyone else in the organization to learn more about it too. So I'm because it's not scalable otherwise. It's like if you centralize that dependency upon you and others to be the only providers of that somehow, then it's not going to scale. But at the same time, it is a challenge in an open system to answer the question, how do you preserve quality and integrity of something as it spreads around the world? And we are in a process of continual inquiry and discovery and more or less successful failure in that, I think.
Yeah, I think the more we speak, I think the more I realize how it's not really a difference in quality between the two approaches, the two practices, but it's much more a difference of maturity of practice. So I think mature holacracy practice probably is, to a large degree, it's probably not indistinguishable, but it's very, very similar to a mature S3 practice, right? And probably you see many of the problems and the misunderstandings in an early holacracy practice compared to early S3 practice. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I see for ourselves, right? Like how can we make it easier and more accessible and kind of lower the barrier to get people more, or let's say to create scaffolding that's available, that's scalable, that has a low barrier of entry, so they can practice well, right? So that they're learning, that they realize, okay, I need to practice consciously, right? Deliberate practice is one of the key things, I think. Not just go through the ropes, but actually practice deliberately, reflect on your practice, because that's the way you get better.
Yeah.
And provide scaffolding that helps people do that, no matter what the context is. So even if you don't have the money to hire an experienced coach, right? Okay, what can we make available that's very, very cheap and very very affordable, and still provides a lot of benefit. And I think you guys have done an incredible job with S3 patterns, because that's all available. And there's still this other thing that's well, how do you apply them now? How do you pick and which ones to pick now? How do you make that kind of, what's the scaffolding for that kind of decision making?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, I think the common sense framework goes some way to helping with that, for sure.
Definitely.
And I have to kind of diminish a bit your claim of we've done a good job, because I think we've done an okay job of approximately describing many of the patterns, and a few of them in more detail. But there's a lot more work can be done to actually document, as you were saying about in the Constitution of, what is it? It's nearer it's nearer like 14, 13 years, isn't it, than 10 years anyway.
Yeah.
And I sometimes feel a bit jealous of the fact that Brian's had a few extra years to think about this and work on it, because I see that we are at the 6-year mark, and we have, we didn't create a business model around S3. It was a hobby of Bernard and I, and then Lily joined, and we just kind of do it in our spare time, and S3 doesn't generate any revenue directly. Actually, it's like we work as freelancers, and if we sell services connected to S3, then we use some of our income, to be able to invest time into developing S3. And one of the things that's frustrated me in recent years was becoming a bottleneck, because of a lack of documentation and other means by which people could access S3. So they became more dependent on us. And we tried to scale things with Learn S3 a couple of years ago by partnering with some other people who were passionate about S3, had experience helping others learn in their own right, and wanted to help them learn about S3. But from Lily's and my side, that was just impossible to sustain. It wasn't a sustainable model, because we were invited to deliver programs locally. Those people came again and again to learn from us, and then we kind of built the market in an area with their help, and then we kind of stood aside and they took over, and we kind of went on to forge a new market, which is fine if you've got income to support that. But we didn't have any revenue to support it, so it wasn't sustainable. And the other thing around that we learned was that, in a way, the people we chose to partner with around that, whom I have a lot of respect for, but they were entrepreneurial and locally orientated, so their investment was seeing the opportunity, appreciating the value S3 could bring, but also seeing the opportunity to commoditize it and offer it as a product as part of their offer. Not to necessarily invest energy into building a more kind of globally coherent approach to supporting others to be able to learn as well. So we kind of our what's the word? I forget the word right now. It's not generosity. That would be like to diminish these people because they're also generous, but it was altruism. Our kind of apparent altruism in service of helping S3 spread was kind of to our own cost. And we sort of polarized with people who were locally orientated instead. So when COVID came, I knew that what we needed to do was somehow get out of that rat race and invest in a radical evolution of learning resources for people to break that bottleneck somehow. We needed a new way. And so we said, okay, we won't pivot in-person courses to online. We'll double down, focus on resource development. We got a bit distracted launching the S3 online learning community, which took 6 months of our time, basically. I think it was a good idea in some respects to bring people together, but it was a bit of a distraction. But essentially what we're working on right now is, as you say, this documentation based on experience, because I feel like it's a social responsibility. You know, if I drop dead tomorrow, I'm going to be extremely dissatisfied with my legacy. You know, I think there's a lot that only we can articulate right now. That until that's in the literary domain,
the commons,
is a risk. You know. Yeah. So I share your opinion. I think that's an important way to go, and providing a myriad of means for people to access wisdom that's been gleaned through interacting with these patterns, and different ways that people can at least have a chance of interpreting them well enough and understand the value of some kind of feedback, whether that's just from peers or whether that is in some kind of contract with somebody who offers professional services around that. I think these are very important things to raise awareness around.
Yeah. Yeah, there are also very interesting developments in the Holacracy community around the whole business model, because that's a very, very common critique. And now H1 has started reaching out to the provider community and collaborating on basically, at the moment it's still, and there's nothing official yet, but they're contemplating really creating a foundation where they basically would, that would steward the constitution and also the licensing and all of that, and H1 would basically just become a provider like everybody else. And yeah, I think that's I'm really, I think it's a very huge step for them to even, yeah, because they're giving something away, right, that's clearly of a lot of value for them, and at the same time it's also, I think, a huge sign of trust on their part towards the ecosystem they've also built. I mean, I think they have done a really great job in building an ecosystem, and not it's always been easy. I mean, there's definitely also a lot of tension in the ecosystem, but that's the thing. That's not a negative thing, right? I think having that tension is the source of all this innovation, right? Nobody can do something like that on their own, right? It's just too big a task. And I think the question is, how can you create what are the necessary conditions for an ecosystem to emerge and to thrive, and so that you, like you say, right? I mean, if you have, and that's still, I think, a big problem also in the Holacracy ecosystem. There's so much work to be done, right? It's such a monumental task, and we still have many of these very, very small companies, like five people, 10 people, 15 people, but still, compared to the task at hand, it's minute. And so for me, a very big question that I'm also pondering is like, how can we the power that we have available, the energy that we have available, the time that we have available, how can we make this more effective? How can we make how can we create more impact with the resources that we have available? So yeah, that it's just beneficial for more people, that this transition is speeding up, right?
Exactly the same questions that we're asking to, on a smaller scale, but yeah, it's the same challenge. So you and I, whenever we speak with each other, we're always kind of very sort of pleasant with each other, and we share a lot of common perspectives and ground. But I'm wondering if there's any kind of like contentious questions or issues that we could touch on, you know, because there are, you know, there are lovers and haters of Holacracy.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I don't know any haters of S3. I know that there's people who appreciate it more or less, at least. And I also, in my experience, you know, I've heard from a lot of others about their experiences with Holacracy and about S3, and I have a couple of questions, at least, in relation to that. So I'm wondering if we could dive into the darkness a bit more and explore some of these more contentious issues before we wrap up our call today. Yeah. How are you doing on time? Because we didn't set a time box on this, and
I think we did until 12:30.
Okay.
So we're already a bit over, and I have a call at 1, so
okay,
I have to slowly wrap it up. But I would be totally open to that idea, maybe in a round 2.
Yeah.
What we could also do is, I mean, if we decide to make this available, we could also invite, you know, everybody who watches this, like what would be some questions or some topics of interest for us to debate, kind of.
Yeah.
To share our perspectives on maybe some of the more controversial topics. That might be fun.
That sounds like a great idea. So we could actually reach out to others to submit some questions. We could bring some of our own and then take it from there. Sounds great to me. Yeah. So Patrick, thanks so much.
Thank you. That was very fun, and I learned a lot. And I'm really curious to dive more in depth. Also, I think there are many interesting things that I still have a very superficial knowledge about with S3, and I would appreciate the opportunity to just to explore the nitty-gritty details and to kind of geek out a bit more on on our practices. And I think that might actually also not just be enjoyable for us, but maybe also beneficial for others. So
yeah, I think so, or at least hope so too. So thank you so much. And I will breathe and be patient to bring these questions I have for next time.
Okay, cool. Yeah, me too. I will give it some thought as well. I will definitely also take a look at the Common Sense framework. I've read through, like I've read it like diagonally, but I just downloaded the ebook before our conversation, but I didn't have the time to read it thoroughly, but I will definitely do that as well.
Yeah, let me know what you think. We haven't gone into detail. It was enough just to kind of nail down the essence of it for now. But I'm curious to see what you think, and try that with somebody, maybe in your organization. Just sit down and reflect on those 10 principles, see if any stand out, any areas you're strong or challenged, and see how it works in practice.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great idea.
Great.
All right.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, and have a nice day, huh?
You too, man. I'll see you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Ciao.